The tears that changed everything. The year was 1970, a cold November morning at Grosbeek Canadian War Cemetery in the Netherlands. Rows upon rows of white headstones stretched across the manicured grass like silent soldiers standing at eternal attention. More than 300 of them, each one marking a young man who never grew old, each one representing a letter that arrived at some farmhouse in Saskatchewan or apartment in Toronto 3 decades ago, beginning with the words that no mother ever wants to read. Among those headstones, a German man knelt in the wet grass. He was 62 years old, his hair white as the marble before him, his back bent by the weight of years and memories. In his weathered hands, he held a bouquet of red tulips, the same color as blood, the same color as the poppies that grew in Flanders fields, the same color as the flowers that Dutch children had thrown at liberating tanks 30 years before. The German was crying. Behind him, watching from a respectful distance, stood an American man, 55 years old, gray at the temples but still strong in the shoulders, the kind of man who had seen things that he would never fully describe to his children, no matter how many times they asked about the war. These two men had tried to kill each other once. They had faced each other across gun sites, in flooded bunkers, in burning streets. They had been enemies in the truest sense of the word. Soldiers on opposite sides of the greatest conflict in human history. One fighting for a regime that had plunged the world into darkness, the other fighting to bring back the light. But now they stood together, in a cemetery, crying over the same graves. This is the story of how two enemies became brothers. And it all began with a single piece of bacon. A breakfast that broke a man. Rewind 31 years. November 1944. The island of Walcheren in the Netherlands. Werner Hoffman sat in a makeshift prisoner, holding area his back against a cold concrete wall. He was 32 years old, a captain in the Wehrmacht, and 3 days ago he had surrendered his bunker to save the lives of 47 teenage soldiers under his command. Boys who should have been learning mathematics in school, boys who instead had learned how to die. For 3 days, Werner had refused to eat. The American and Canadian guards brought him food regularly. Real food, better food than he had seen in years. But Werner pushed it away every time, partly from pride, partly from the propaganda that still echoed in his skull. The enemy poisons their prisoners, the instructors had said. They want information. They will drug you. They will break you. But mostly Werner refused to eat because eating would mean accepting. It would mean acknowledging that everything he had believed, everything he had fought for, everything that had cost him his father and his home, and 5 years of his life had been built on lies. On the morning of the fourth day, an American sergeant walked into the holding area. He was young, maybe 24, tall and lean, with the kind of face that belonged on a farm somewhere, not in a war zone. He carried a metal tray covered with a cloth, and he walked directly to Werner without hesitation. The sergeant knelt down and placed the tray on the ground. Then he removed the cloth. Werner stared. On that tray sat 4 strips of bacon, perfectly crisped, glistening with fat. 2 eggs fried over easy, their yolks bright yellow like small suns. 2 slices of white bread slathered with real butter, and a metal cup filled with coffee so fresh that steam still rose from its surface. The smell hit Werner like a physical force. Bacon. Real bacon. He had not smelled bacon since 1940. For 5 years, his diet had consisted of hard black bread that could chip teeth, watery soup with mysterious floating objects, and an occasional sausage made from ingredients best left unexamined. This was what the glorious German war machine fed its officers. This was what he had accepted as normal. And here was an American sergeant offering him a breakfast fit for a king, offering it to a prisoner, offering it to an enemy. The sergeant spoke in broken German, rough but sincere. Essen, kein Gift. Eat, no poison. Werner looked at the young American, looked at the food, looked back at the American. Something cracked inside him. Something that had been holding him together through 5 years of war, through the death of his father at Stalingrad, through the bombing of his home in Hamburg, through the order to defend an island that everyone knew was already lost. Werner Hoffman, captain of the Wehrmacht, former mathematics teacher, survivor of 100 battles, began to cry. Not the dignified tears of a defeated soldier, not the quiet weeping of a man mourning his comrades. These were the heaving, gasping sobs of a child who has just learned that the monster under his bed was never real. that he had been afraid of shadows, that he had spent 5 years fighting for shadows. The American sergeant did not move, did not speak. He simply waited while the German officer wept over a plate of bacon and eggs. When Werner finally looked up, his eyes red and his face wet, he saw something in the young American's expression that he had not expected. Not triumph, not contempt, not even pity. Understanding. The sergeant's name was Tom Sullivan. He was 24 years old from Minnesota, and he had come to the Netherlands to fulfill a promise to his dying grandmother. He had crossed an ocean, fought through Normandy, slogged through Belgium, and watched 9 of his closest friends die in a single night on the banks of a canal called Leopold. And now he was feeding breakfast to a man who, under different circumstances, might have killed him. Why? Werner asked in English. His voice was hoarse from crying. Why do you do this? Tom Sullivan considered the question. Then he reached into his breast pocket and pulled out an envelope, yellowed with age and soft from being handled too many times. He showed it to Werner without opening it. My grandmother wrote this letter 50 years ago. She never got to send it. She made me promise to deliver it before she died. Tom paused. She was Dutch, from a town called Delft. She had a brother she never saw again after she left for America. Werner looked at the envelope, then at the breakfast, then at the young American who had every reason to hate him, but instead had chosen kindness. I do not understand your country, Werner said. Tom almost smiled. Neither do I sometimes, but I understand that you are hungry, and I understand that hungry men should eat. He stood up and walked away, leaving Werner alone with the food. Werner picked up a strip of bacon. He had forgotten how crispy it was supposed to be, how the fat dissolved on the tongue, how the salt and the smoke combined into something almost sinful. He ate it slowly, savoring every molecule, and with each bite he felt another piece of the old Werner Hoffmann crumble away. By the time he finished the meal, he was no longer the same man. But to understand why that breakfast mattered so much, you must first understand what came before it. You must go back 6 weeks, to a night when Tom Sullivan crossed a canal that might as well have been the River Styx, to a morning when he counted the survivors of his squad and found only 3 faces looking back. This is that story. The letter that started everything 6 months before the bacon, spring 1904, the town of New Ulm, Minnesota. Tom Sullivan stood at the bedside of his grandmother, Elizabeth Vanderburg. Sullivan watching the life slowly drain from her 90-year-old body. She had raised him after his mother died when he was 12. She had taught him to read, to fish, to tell right from wrong. She had filled his childhood with stories of a faraway land called Holland, where the tulips bloomed in colors that Americans could not imagine, and where windmills turned lazily against skies as gray as pearl. Now she was dying, and she had one final request. The letter, Elizabeth whispered, her voice like paper rustling in wind. In my bureau, the top drawer, under my wedding shawl. Tom found it. A yellowed envelope addressed in faded ink to Willem Vanderburg, Delft, Holland. The postmark was from 1894. 50 years old, never sent. My brother, Elizabeth said when he brought it to her. I left without saying goodbye. I was 18. I was in love with your grandfather. I was stupid and young, and I thought I would get back someday. She coughed a wet sound that made Tom wince. Someday never came. What do you want me to do? Oh, find him, find Willem, or find his children or his grandchildren. Someone from my family. Her hand found his, cold and fragile as a bird's wing. Deliver the letter. Tell them Elizabeth never forgot. Grandmother, I don't even know if he's still alive. The Germans occupy Holland now. I can't just... Promise me. Tom looked at the woman who had been mother and father and best friend to him for 12 years. The woman who had cried at his high school graduation, who had cheered at his baseball games, who had sat with him through 100 Minnesota winters telling stories about tulips and canals and a brother she had abandoned. I promise. Elizabeth smiled. It was the last smile he ever saw on her face. She died 3 days later, still holding the letter. 2 weeks after the funeral, Tom Sullivan volunteered for a transfer to the 1st Canadian Army. It was the unit assigned to liberate the Netherlands. His commanding officer thought he was crazy. The Canadians were heading into some of the worst fighting of the war. Smart soldiers tried to avoid that kind of assignment. Tom did not care about smart. He cared about a promise. He tucked the letter into his breast pocket right next to his heart and shipped out to England. From England to Normandy. From Normandy to Belgium. And finally, in early October 1944, to the banks of a canal called Leopold, where the worst night of his life was waiting, the night everything changed, October 1904, the Leopold Canal, somewhere in the Breskens Pocket, Netherlands. Tom stood on the south bank with his squad, 12 men who had become brothers over the past 4 months of combat. They had landed together at Juno Beach. They had fought together through the hedgerows of Normandy. They had survived the meat grinder of Falaise and the bloody push through Belgium. 12 men who knew each other's fears and dreams and the names of the girls waiting for them back home. Lieutenant James O'Brien was their leader. 26 years old from Boston with a new bride named Sarah, who was 7 months pregnant with a child he had never met. Jimmy, as everyone called him, had a gift for keeping men calm under fire. He could crack a joke while shells exploded overhead, and somehow that joke would make everything seem survivable. Corporal Mickey Kowalski was Tom's best friend. 23 Polish heritage from Chicago with a Hershey chocolate bar in his pocket at all times because, as he explained, you never know when you need emergency morale. Mickey had a laugh that could fill a room and a stubborn streak that had saved his life more than once. Private Danny was the youngest, 19, fresh from basic training. This would be his first real battle. The other 9 men had names and faces and stories that Tom would remember for the rest of his life. He would remember them in the middle of the night 50 years later when the dreams came back. He would remember them at Christmas dinner, surrounded by grandchildren, when a certain angle of light would suddenly transport him back to that canal bank in October. But for now, they were just his squad, 12 men, getting ready to cross. The mission was straightforward on paper. Cross the Leopold Canal, establish a bridgehead on the north bank, hold the position until reinforcements arrived. The generals had drawn it up with neat arrows on clean maps the way generals always did. The generals were not the ones who had to get in the boats. The canal was 60 feet wide. The far bank was held by German troops who had been preparing their positions for months. They had machine guns pre-registered on every likely crossing point. They had mortars zeroed in on the water itself. They had flares ready to turn night into day the moment the first boat pushed off. And the only way across was in small rubber boats paddled by hand, carrying men weighed down with 60 pounds of equipment. Jimmy gathered the squad for a final briefing. He poured coffee from a thermos into each man's cup, a small ritual he had maintained since Normandy. The coffee was weak and bitter and barely warm, but it was American coffee, and somehow that made it precious. "Listen up," Jimmy said, keeping his voice low. "When we hit the water, paddle hard and don't stop for anything. If the boat next to you gets hit, keep paddling. If the man next to you gets hit, keep paddling. Get to the far bank, get out of the boat, and run for cover. Don't think. Don't hesitate. Just run." "And if we make it?" Mickey asked. Jimmy almost smiled. "Then we dig in and hold until morning. Easy." No one laughed. They all knew there was nothing easy about what they were about to do. But they checked their weapons and tightened their straps and said silent prayers to whatever gods they believed in, because that was what soldiers did when the orders came down. At 0300 hours, the first boats pushed off. Tom was in the second wave. He knelt in the rubber boat with Mickey on one side and Danny on the other, paddle in his hands, eyes straining into the darkness ahead. For a few seconds, there was only the soft splash of paddles and the whisper of wind and the pounding of his own heart. Then the Germans fired their first flare. The world turned white. The entire canal lit up like a stadium. Every shadow erased every boat suddenly visible against the dark water. And then the machine guns opened up. The sound was unlike anything else in war. The German MG-42 fired 1,200 rounds per minute so fast that individual shots blurred into a continuous tearing roar. Tracer rounds cut across the water like laser beams, red and orange and green, beautiful and terrible. The boat ahead of Tom's took a direct burst. He watched it happen in what seemed like slow motion. Watched the rubber puncture. Watched the men spill into the water, their packs dragging them under before they could even scream. 4 men, there and then gone, swallowed by the black canal like stones thrown into a well. "Keep paddling," Jimmy shouted from somewhere ahead. "Don't stop, keep paddling." Tom paddled. His arms burned. Water splashed onto his face, cold and tasting of mud. Something hot zipped past his ear, close enough to feel the heat. He did not stop to think about what it was. He just paddled. The boat hit the far bank with a soft thump. Tom threw himself over the side, dropping into water that came up to his chest. Cold. Colder than anything he had experienced. The cold seized his lungs and tried to crush them. 60 pounds of gear tried to pull him under. He fought forward. 1 step, 2 steps. His boots sank into the mud at the bottom. Each step was a negotiation with gravity. With death. A hand grabbed his arm. Mickey. Together they stumbled toward the bank, dragging themselves out of the water and onto the muddy slope. They had made it. Tom turned to check on the others. In the flickering light of flares and muzzle flashes, he saw Danny crawling up the bank, his face a mask of terror, but his body still moving. Good. Then he saw Jimmy. The lieutenant was lying on his back at the water's edge. Not moving, a dark stain spreading across his chest. Tom crawled to him, took his hand, felt the warmth already leaving it. "Tell Sarah," Jimmy whispered. His eyes were looking at something far away, something Tom could not see. "Tell her I—" The sentence never finished. Jimmy's hand went slack. His chest stopped rising. And somewhere in Boston, a woman who would never see her husband again woke from a dream with her hand pressed against her swollen belly. Tom stayed with the body until Mickey pulled him away. "We have to move. They're bringing up mortars." The rest of the night was chaos. Mud and blood and the endless chatter of machine guns. Men screaming in the darkness. Men dying in the darkness. Tom fired his rifle until it jammed, cleared it, fired again. At some point, a mortar shell landed close enough to shower him with dirt and something wet that might have been part of someone he knew. When dawn finally came creeping gray and reluctant over the flat Dutch landscape, Tom looked around at what remained of his squad. Mickey was alive. Wounded in the shoulder, but alive. Danny was alive. His eyes had the 1,000-yard stare that Tom had seen in too many veterans, but he was breathing. Everyone else was gone. 12 men had climbed into the boats the night before. 3 were left. Tom found Jimmy's body and recovered the photograph from his pocket, Sarah smiling, one hand on her pregnant belly. He would keep that photograph for the rest of his life. He would eventually track down Sarah after the war and give it to Jimmy's son, a boy named James Jr., who grew up without ever knowing his father's laugh. But all of that was in the future. On that cold October morning, Tom Sullivan sat in a muddy trench on the north bank of the Leopold Canal and tried to remember how to breathe. The company had started the night with 120 men. By dawn, 31 were still able to fight, and the battle for the Netherlands had only just begun, the man on the other side. At the same time that Tom Sullivan was counting his dead, Werner Hoffman was preparing to die. Werner had arrived on Walcheren Island 3 weeks earlier, assigned to command a company defending a section of the coastal fortifications. The posting was a death sentence, and everyone knew it. The Allies needed to open the port of Antwerp, and Walcheren controlled the entrance to the Scheldt estuary. The island would be attacked. The island would fall. The only question was how long the defenders could delay the inevitable. Werner did not believe in the war anymore. He had stopped believing after Stalingrad, when his father's name appeared on the casualty list. He had stopped believing after Hamburg, when British bombers reduced his childhood home to rubble. He had stopped believing after watching his best students get conscripted, one by one, sent to fronts from which they never returned. But he kept fighting, not for Germany, not for Hitler, not for the 1,000-year Reich that was rapidly shrinking to a few hundred days. He kept fighting for Liesel. His sister was 16 years old. She and their mother had survived the Hamburg bombing and were living in a basement shelter, eating whatever scraps they could find. Every letter Werner received from Liesel, all was thinner, written on smaller paper, filled with more desperate optimism. "We are fine," she always wrote. "Do not worry about us. Come home soon." Werner kept those letters in his breast pocket, next to a photograph of his family taken in 1938 before the madness began. His father, stern but kind. His mother, beautiful in her Sunday dress. Liesel, at 10 years old, missing her front teeth, grinning at the camera. And Werner himself, 26, just starting his career as a mathematics teacher, full of plans for a future that would never arrive. He touched that photograph a dozen times a day. It reminded him why he was still alive, why he had not simply walked into enemy fire and let it all end. Because if Germany lost, who would protect Liesel? The irony was not lost on him. He was fighting for a regime that had destroyed everything he loved in order to protect the only thing he had left. It was madness. But it was the only madness available. On October 3rd, the Allies made their move. Werner was in his bunker when the bombers came, not to attack the fortifications directly. The bombers went for the dikes, the ancient seawalls that kept the North Sea from reclaiming the low-lying island. One bomb, two, 10, 20. The dikes broke. Werner heard it before he saw it. A roar like a freight train growing louder by the second. Then the water came, rushing through the gaps in the dikes, pouring across the island, flooding fields and roads and defensive positions. The North Sea finally released from its cage, reclaiming what had always belonged to it. Within hours, the center of Walcheren was underwater. German defenders who had dug positions in the lowlands were forced to evacuate or drown. The carefully prepared killing grounds became useless. The fortress island was being attacked not by enemy soldiers, but by the ocean itself. The Allies had turned nature into a weapon. Werner pulled his men back to the coastal bunkers, the only positions still above water. They were surrounded now, cut off from reinforcement or retreat. Fewer than 50 men against whatever force the Allies chose to send. The order from Berlin was clear. Fight to the last man, delay the enemy as long as possible, die gloriously for the fatherland. Werner read the order and thought about Liesel, thought about the 16-year-old boys in his command who should have been learning algebra, thought about the photograph in his pocket and the family that no longer existed and the future that had been stolen from all of them. He decided in that moment that he would not obey. When the Allied forces came, when the rubber boats full of Canadian and American soldiers hit the beach, when the outcome was no longer in doubt, Werner Hoffmann would surrender. He would save as many of his boys as possible. He would survive to see Liesel again. It was not brave. It was not glorious. It was simply what a mathematics teacher who had never wanted to be a soldier chose to do when faced with the meaningless death that Berlin demanded. And so when Tom Sullivan kicked open the bunker door 3 weeks later, his rifle raised, his face streaked with mud and exhaustion, Werner was waiting for him. Hands raised, surrounded by 47 teenage soldiers who would live to see another day because their captain had chosen common sense over fanaticism. The two men looked at each other across the smoke-filled bunker. Neither of them knew that this moment would matter, that 30 years later they would stand together in a cemetery mourning the same dead bound by a friendship forged in the ashes of war. All they knew in that moment was that the fighting was over. For both of them in different ways, the real journey was just beginning. The girl who walked through fire, December 1901, the front lines near Nijmegen, Netherlands. The winter had come early and cruel that year. Snow fell on battlefields still littered with the debris of autumn fighting. Ice formed on the canals where so many men had drowned. The cold seeped into everything, into bones, into souls, into the hearts of soldiers who had seen too much death and were beginning to wonder if spring would ever come again. Tom Sullivan was on night patrol when he saw her, a figure moving through the darkness, small, quick, heading toward the German lines with a determination that bordered on madness. Anyone crossing the no-man's land between the armies was either a spy, a fool, or someone with nothing left to lose. Tom raised his rifle. "Halt! Stop right there!" The figure froze, then slowly turned around. She was young, maybe 22. Her face was gaunt, the cheekbones protruding like knife blades beneath skin that seemed almost translucent in the moonlight. Her eyes were sunken, but burning with an intensity that Tom had never seen before. Not the intensity of fear, the intensity of purpose. "I am Anna," she said in accented English. "Anna de Vries. I carry messages from Amsterdam. And I am telling you that 4.5 million people are dying on the other side of those German lines." Tom kept his rifle raised. Dying how? Starvation. The word came out flat, factual, as if she had said it so many times that it no longer carried emotional weight. The Germans cut off all food transport in September. Retaliation for the railway strike. Official rations are now 320 calories per day. Do you know how much that is? Tom shook his head. One apple, one small apple for an entire day. For 6 months now. Anna reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something small and withered. She held it out toward him. "This is what my mother ate for dinner last week. A tulip bulb, dug from the garden my grandfather planted 40 years ago. She boiled it for 2 hours to make it soft enough to chew." Tom stared at the dried bulb in her palm. It looked like something you would throw away. Something not fit for animals, let alone humans. "Your mother," he said carefully, "is she Dead 3 weeks ago. Anna's voice did not waver, but her eyes, those burning eyes, they flickered for just a moment. She gave her food to my younger brother. She said she was not hungry. She lied until she could not lie anymore. Tom lowered his rifle. He thought about his own breakfast that morning. Powdered eggs, canned meat crackers, chocolate and coffee. A meal he had complained about because the eggs were too bland and the coffee was too weak. A meal that could have kept Anna's mother alive for another week. Without thinking, he reached into his pack and pulled out his emergency rations. A full day's worth of food. Enough calories to sustain a soldier in combat. He held it out to her. Take it. Bring it back to whoever needs it most. Anna looked at the rations, then at Tom. Her expression shifted from suspicion to confusion to something that might have been hope. Why, she asked. You do not know me, you owe me nothing. Tom thought about his grandmother, about the letter in his breast pocket, about the promise he had made to a dying woman in Minnesota. My grandmother was Dutch, he said. Born in Delft, she left 50 years ago and never came back. She used to tell me stories about the tulip fields and the windmills and the canals that ran through every town like silver ribbons. He paused. She never told me that someday her people would be eating those tulips to survive. Anna's eyes widened. Delft, you have family in Delft. I do not know. My grandmother had a brother named Willem. She lost contact with him when she immigrated to America. I promised her I would find him, or find his children, or find anyone who remembers. For the first time, Anna's mask cracked, a small smile, barely visible, but real. I am also from Delft, she said. Before the war, before everything. They stood there in the frozen darkness, two strangers connected by a town they had never shared, but both somehow belonged to. The wind howled across the no man's land. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled like approaching thunder. I will come back, Anna said, taking the rations and tucking them into her coat. Every week if I can, I bring information about German positions, troop movements, supply routes. The resistance has eyes everywhere. And I will have food waiting, Tom said, whatever I can spare. Anna nodded. She started to turn away, then stopped. The letter, the one from your grandmother. Do you know what it says? Tom shook his head. I never opened it. It was not addressed to me. Maybe you should. Maybe it will help you understand why you are here, why any of us are here. She smiled again, that ghost of a smile that seemed to cost her tremendous effort. Good night, soldier from Minnesota. I will see you again. She disappeared into the darkness, moving toward the German lines with the same fearless determination she had shown before. Tom watched her go, wondering if he would ever see her again, wondering if she would survive the crossing, wondering how many people on the other side of those lines were slowly starving to death while he complained about bland eggs. He would not know Anna's fate for many months. Every time she vanished back into occupied territory, he would lie awake in his foxhole, staring at the stars, asking the universe to keep her safe. Every time she reappeared thinner than before, her eyes more hollow but still burning, he would feel a relief so profound it almost brought him to tears. But that was the nature of war. You learn to live with uncertainty. You learn to hope without expectation. You learn that the people who mattered most could be taken from you at any moment without warning, without reason, without the chance to say goodbye. Tom had already learned that lesson at the Leopold Canal. He was about to learn it again. The numbers that haunted a nation. To understand what Anna was fighting against, you must understand what the Germans had done. In September 1944, the Dutch railway workers went on strike. It was an act of resistance designed to support the Allied advance during Operation Market Garden. Brave, defiant, exactly the kind of thing that resistance movements are supposed to do. The Germans responded with collective punishment on a scale that defied comprehension. They imposed a complete embargo on food transport to the Western Netherlands. No trains, no trucks, no boats, nothing. The cities of Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague and Utrecht were cut off from the agricultural regions that fed them. 4.5 million people suddenly had no access to food. At first, the rations were merely inadequate. 1,000 calories per day, then 800, then 500. By December, the official ration had dropped to 320 calories. Less than 1/6 of what a human body needs to survive. Less than what concentration camp prisoners received in some cases. People ate what they could find. Tulip bulbs became a staple food. Sugar beets meant for animal feed became a delicacy. Potato peels were collected and traded like currency. Some people ate grass. Some ate sawdust mixed with water. Some simply stopped eating and waited for the end. The winter of 1904 to 19 would later be called the Hunger Winter. The Hunger Winter. More than 20,000 Dutch civilians died from starvation and related diseases. Tens of thousands more suffered permanent health damage. An entire generation of children grew up malnourished, their physical and mental development stunted by months of deprivation. And just 30 miles away, American and Canadian soldiers sat in their trenches eating 3 hot meals a day, completely unaware of the catastrophe unfolding behind enemy lines. Tom Sullivan was one of the first to learn the truth. Anna told him, and once he knew he could never unknow it, he started saving his rations, skipping meals, telling his squad mates he was not hungry when his stomach was growling. Every chocolate bar, every can of meat, every packet of crackers went into a pile that he would give to Anna during her weekly crossings. Other soldiers noticed, some called him crazy, some called him a saint. Most just shook their heads and wondered what had gotten into the quiet sergeant from Minnesota. Mickey Kowalski was the only one who understood. "It is because of your grandmother," Mickey said one night, huddled together in a foxhole for warmth. "You are trying to save the country she came from." Tom nodded. "She used to say that Holland was the most beautiful place on earth, that the flowers there bloomed in colors Americans could not imagine, that the people were kind and strong and would give you their last piece of bread if you needed it." He paused. "Now those people are eating the flowers, and I am sitting here with more food than I can eat. You cannot save 4 million people with chocolate bars, Tom." "No, but I can save the ones I can reach, and maybe that has to be enough." Mickey was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his emergency Hershey bar, the one he always carried, the one he had joked about for 4 months straight. "Here," he said, pressing it into Tom's hand. "Give it to her next time. Tell her it is from Chicago." Tom looked at the chocolate, then at his friend. "Mickey, this is your lucky charm. You never go anywhere without it." "Maybe my luck is meant to be shared," Mickey shrugged. "Besides, I have been looking for an excuse to lose weight." They both laughed, the hollow, desperate laughter of men who had nothing left but each other. But in that moment, in that frozen foxhole surrounded by death and suffering, something beautiful existed. The simple willingness of one human being to sacrifice for another. It was a small act, one chocolate bar out of millions. But small acts repeated enough times can change the world. Tom would remember that lesson for the rest of his life. The general who chose mercy, April 1945. The city of Groningen, Netherlands. 4 months had passed since Tom first met Anna. 4 months of brutal fighting through the Rhineland. 4 months of watching friends die in battles whose names would fill history books. Kleve, Goch, Xanten. Towns that meant nothing to Americans back home, but meant everything to the men who bled for them. Mickey had been wounded in February. A German shell had landed too close, shattering his right leg beyond repair. The medics had saved his life, but not his limb. He was evacuated to a hospital in England, where surgeons did what they could and taught him to walk with a prosthetic. The last thing Mickey said before they carried him away was, "Keep the chocolate coming, Tom. I expect a full report when I get back." Tom never saw him again during the war, but he kept the promise. Every week he collected what food he could and passed it to Anna during her clandestine crossings. Every week she brought back intelligence about German positions. Every week they stole a few minutes to talk. About Delft, about Minneapolis, about the lives they hoped to live when the madness finally ended. Tom was falling in love. He knew it. Anna probably knew it too. But neither of them spoke the words. In wartime, love was a luxury, a hostage to fortune. You did not admit to loving someone until you were certain you would both survive. By early April, the end was finally in sight. Allied forces were pouring into Germany from all directions. The Nazi regime was collapsing. Victory in Europe was weeks away, perhaps days. But in the Netherlands, more than 120,000 German troops still held the western provinces. Amsterdam, Rotterdam. The Hague remained under occupation. And behind those German lines, millions of Dutch civilians continued to starve. Tom's unit was assigned to capture Groningen, a medieval university city in the northeastern Netherlands. 150,000 civilians lived there, swollen by refugees from the south. 7,000 German troops defended it, a mix of regular Wehrmacht Luftwaffe ground forces, naval sailors, and Waffen-SS units that included Dutch volunteers who knew they faced execution if captured. The Germans had turned the city into a fortress. The old medieval core was surrounded by a wide canal with only 12 bridges providing access. Most had been destroyed or razed. Every street corner had been fortified. Every building had been prepared for defense. The standard military approach would be simple. Surround the city, call in artillery, bomb the defensive positions until nothing remained but rubble. Then send in the infantry to mop up. It was efficient. It was effective. It was also guaranteed to kill thousands of civilians. Major General Bernard Mitchell, commanding the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, had a decision to make. Tom was present at the briefing where that decision was announced. He stood in the back of a crowded farmhouse, surrounded by officers and NCOs who all expected to hear the standard orders. Prepare for artillery support. Coordinate with air assets. Reduce the defensive positions before advancing. Instead, General Mitchell stood in front of a map of Groningen and said 6 words that changed everything. No artillery, no air support. The room went silent. Every man understood what that meant. Without heavy weapons, they would have to take the city building by building, room by room. Casualties would triple, perhaps quadruple. Men who might have survived behind a wall of steel would instead die in doorways and stairwells. The colonel in the front row spoke up. "Sir, with respect, our casualties will be catastrophic." "I know," Mitchell said. His voice was steady but tired, the voice of a man who had not slept properly in months. "I have a son at home, 8 years old. He writes to me every week asking when I am coming back. I want to see him again more than anything in the world." He paused, looked around the room, made eye contact with as many men as he could. But there are 150,000 people in that city. Children, old men, mothers. They have been under occupation for 5 years. They have been starving for 6 months. They have been waiting for us to save them. Mitchell turned back to the map, traced his finger along the canal that surrounded the old city. "I will not save them by turning their homes into rubble. I will not liberate them by killing them. We will take this city with infantry and tanks. We will accept higher casualties so that civilians can live. That is my decision. That is my order." No one spoke. No one argued. Every man in that room understood that they were being asked to die so that strangers might live. It was the hardest thing a soldier could be asked to do, and it was also the most noble. Tom thought about Anna, about her mother who had starved to death, about the tulip bulbs and the 320 calories and the millions of people waiting behind those German lines. He thought about the letter in his pocket and the grandmother who had loved a country she never returned to. He understood in that moment why he had come here, why he had crossed an ocean and watched his friends die and endured horrors that would haunt his dreams forever. Not for medals, not for glory, not even for victory, for the chance to be the kind of man who would sacrifice himself for strangers. 4 days in hell. The battle for Groningen began on April 13th, 1945. It would last 4 days. 4 days of the most intense urban combat that Tom had ever experienced. 4 days that would leave scars on his body and his mind that would never fully heal. Tom was now a sergeant commanding a squad of 8 men in the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry. 8 strangers who had become brothers in the way that only soldiers can. 8 men who trusted him with their lives and expected him to bring them home. He would lose 3 of them in Groningen. The fighting was unlike anything from the open fields and forests of the previous months. In the city, death could come from any direction. From a window 3 stories up, from a basement grate at your feet, from a doorway that had seemed empty a second ago. The medieval streets were narrow and winding, designed for horse carts and pedestrians, not for tanks and infantry squads. The Germans fought with the desperation of men who knew the war was lost but had not yet been given permission to surrender. SS units refused to give ground. Dutch collaborators fought even harder, knowing that capture meant a noose. Regular Wehrmacht soldiers, exhausted and demoralized, nevertheless held their positions until they were killed or overrun. Tom's squad moved through the Southern District, clearing buildings one at a time. The process was brutal and terrifying and monotonous all at once. Approach a door, kick it in, throw a grenade, rush inside, shoot anything that moved. Check the bodies, move to the next room, repeat. Sometimes the buildings were empty. Sometimes they held German soldiers who surrendered immediately, hands raised, eyes empty. Sometimes they held soldiers who fought to the last bullet. Sometimes they held civilians huddled in corners, too terrified to move. On the second day, Tom kicked open a door and found himself face to face with a German soldier who could not have been more than 16 years old. The boy was sitting in the corner of what had once been a living room, his rifle across his lap, his hands shaking so badly that he could not have aimed if he tried. Tom raised his own rifle. The boy looked up at him with eyes that were not the eyes of a soldier. They were the eyes of a child who had been given a uniform and a weapon and told to die for a country that had already died. Hände hoch, Tom said, hands up. The boy dropped his rifle, raised his hands, and started to cry. Tom lowered his weapon. He crossed the room and knelt beside the boy, feeling something inside himself crack. This was not an enemy. This was someone's son, someone's brother, someone who should have been learning mathematics in a classroom instead of bleeding in a war zone. "What is your name?" Tom asked in his broken German. "Wilhelm," the boy whispered. "Wilhelm Braun." "How old are you, Wilhelm?" 16. 16. The same age as Liesel Hoffman, whose brother had surrendered to save 47 boys just like this one. The same age as the students Werner Hoffman had taught before the war took everything. Tom pulled out a chocolate bar from his pocket, one of the last he had saved for Anna. He pressed it into the boy's hands. "The war is over for you," Tom said. "You are going to a prisoner camp. You will be fed. You will be safe. And someday you will go home to your mother." Wilhelm looked at the chocolate, then at Tom. Something shifted in his expression. The terror began to fade, replaced by confusion, then disbelief, then something that might have been gratitude. "Danke," he whispered. "Danke." Tom helped him to his feet and handed him off to the soldiers collecting prisoners. He never saw Wilhelm Braun again, but he thought about that boy for the rest of his life, wondered if he made it home, wondered if he ever told his children about the American sergeant who gave him chocolate instead of a bullet. The fighting continued. Day 3, day 4, house by house, room by room. 3 men from Tom's squad died in those 4 days. Private Henderson shot by a sniper he never saw. Corporal Williams killed by a grenade thrown from a second-story window. Private Chen caught in the crossfire during a German counterattack. 3 more names to add to the list. 3 more letters to write. 3 more families who would receive telegrams beginning with words that no one ever wanted to read. But on the afternoon of April 16th, it ended. The train station. The final German strongpoint in Groningen was the central train station, a massive brick building that commanded the approaches from the south and east. 50 German soldiers held it under the command of an officer who had refused every demand for surrender. Tom's squad was assigned to the assault team. They approached from the west using the bombed-out shells of warehouses as cover. Sherman tanks from the Fort Garry Horse provided support, their main guns blasting through walls to create new doorways. But in the narrow streets around the station, the tanks were vulnerable. 2 were knocked out by Panzerfaust rockets before they could even engage. Tom led his 5 remaining men through the rubble, moving from cover to cover, trading fire with defenders who seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of ammunition. The noise was overwhelming. Rifles, machine guns, tank cannons, grenades, the screams of wounded men in 3 different languages. They reached the station's west entrance. Tom pressed his back against the wall, caught his breath, and prepared to lead the assault. One more push, one more building, one more chance to die. "Sergeant!" One of his men pointed toward the main entrance. A German officer was emerging, hands raised high, a white cloth tied to his rifle. The shooting stopped. Not all at once, but in waves as word spread down the line that someone was surrendering. After 4 days of constant combat, the sudden silence was almost painful. Tom stepped forward, his rifle still raised, his eyes scanning for any sign of treachery. The German officer walked toward him with the slow, deliberate steps of a man who was very tired and very finished. And then Tom recognized him. The same gaunt face, the same exhausted eyes, the same posture of a man who had given up on glory and chosen survival instead. Werner Hoffman. They had faced each other twice before. Once in the bunker at Walcheren, when Hoffman had surrendered to save his teenage soldiers. Once in the holding area when Tom had offered him a breakfast that broke something inside him. Now for the third time they stood across from each other. Enemy and enemy, captor and captive. Two men who kept finding each other in the wreckage of a dying war. "We meet again," Tom said. Hoffman nodded slowly. "I had hoped the next time would be the last." "How did you get here? You were a prisoner." "The transport was attacked. I escaped. I walked for 3 weeks. They gave me another command because they had no one else." Hoffman's voice was flat, drained of everything except exhaustion. "I have been trying to surrender for 2 days, but the SS would shoot any officer who suggested it. I had to wait until they ran out of bullets." Tom lowered his rifle. Around him, German soldiers were emerging from the station with their hands up. Dozens of them, then hundreds. The fight was over. "How many?" Tom asked. 52 of us left. We started with 300. Hoffman paused. "Your general made the right choice. No artillery." "I watched the shells land on the eastern edge of the city. If he had used them here in the center, thousands would have died. Your men paid the price so that the civilians could live. 43 of our men died taking the city, 166 wounded, 110 civilians killed in the crossfire, and 150,000 saved." Hoffman met Tom's eyes. "That is the calculus of war. You cannot save everyone. You can only save who you can save." Tom thought about Anna, about her mother, about the chocolate bars and the tulip bulbs and the 320 calories. He thought about the letter in his pocket that he still had not opened. "I have something to ask you," Tom said. "Something personal." Hoffman waited. "My grandmother was from Delft. She left 50 years ago and never came back. She had a brother named Willem. She wrote him a letter but never sent it." Tom touched his breast pocket. "I promised her I would deliver it. But I do not know if Willem is still alive. I do not even know where to look." Hoffman considered this. "Delft is still occupied, but not for long. The war will end within weeks, perhaps days. When it does, you can search for your family. If they survived the hunger." "If they survived," Hoffman nodded. "Many did not, but many did. The Dutch are stubborn people. They do not die easily." Guards arrived to take Hoffman and the other prisoners away. But before he left, Hoffman reached into his breast pocket and pulled out the photograph he always carried. The family portrait from 1938. His father, his mother, Liesel at 10 years old. "My sister," he said, showing it to Tom. "Liesel, 16 years old now. She is in Hamburg, living in a basement shelter with my mother. I have not seen her in 2 years. I do not know if she is alive." He looked at the photograph, then at Tom. "You asked me once why I cried when you gave me bacon. This is why. Because I thought of Liesel eating whatever scraps she could find while I ate like a king in an American prison camp. Because I realized that the enemy was feeding me better than my own country fed my family. Because everything I had believed was a lie." Tom looked at the photograph, a family frozen in time, a moment of happiness before the world burned. "I hope you find her," he said. "I hope you find Willem," Hoffman replied. They shook hands, two enemies who had become something else, not quite friends, not yet, but no longer enemies either, something in between, something that would take 30 more years to fully understand. Then Hoffman walked away with the other prisoners, and Tom turned back to the city they had just liberated. The day the bombs became bread, 2 weeks after Groningen fell, the war reached its strangest chapter. Allied forces were pushing west, liberating town after town, racing toward Amsterdam and Rotterdam and The Hague. But a new crisis had emerged. The Germans still controlled the dike systems throughout the Western Netherlands. If pushed too hard, they could open the floodgates and drown the very people the Allies were trying to save. 4.5 million people, already starving, now facing the possibility of drowning. Negotiations began, secret meetings in farmhouses and abandoned schools. Allied commanders speaking to German generals, enemies talking like civilized men, while their soldiers still shot at each other a few miles away. On April 28, 1945, a truce was announced. The Germans agreed to stop fighting in the Western Netherlands. In exchange, the Allies would be allowed to deliver food to the starving civilian population. Trucks would cross German lines without being attacked. Aircraft would drop supplies without being shot down. It was unprecedented, a pause in the middle of a war so that both sides could cooperate in saving lives. The kind of thing that should not have been possible. The kind of thing that restored a small measure of faith in humanity. The next day, April 29th, the skies over Holland filled with aircraft. Tom was standing in a field outside Groningen when he heard them coming. Hundreds of engines droning like thunder. He looked up and saw wave after wave of Lancaster bombers and B-17 flying fortresses, flying so low that he could see the pilots in their cockpits. The bomb bay doors opened. For a moment, Tom's heart stopped. After everything he had survived, after every battle and every near miss, he thought the bombers were making a terrible mistake. He thought he was about to die under friendly fire. Then the objects began to fall. Not bombs, not explosives, not death. Sacks, crates, packages, flour, powdered milk, canned meat, chocolate, cigarettes, medicine. 510 tons of food on the first day alone. The supplies tumbled from the sky like gifts from God, landing in fields and parks and open spaces that had been marked with white sheets by the resistance. Dutch civilians rushed to collect them, crying and laughing and holding packages of food above their heads like trophies. Tom watched it happen. Watched the bombers that had once brought death now bringing life. Watched the war transform into something else, something he had never expected to see. On the rooftops of nearby villages, people had painted messages in white letters large enough to be seen from the sky. "Thank you, Canadians. Bless you, boys. We will never forget." On May 2nd, the trucks began rolling. Tom volunteered to drive one of them. A convoy of supply vehicles crossing German lines, delivering food directly to distribution centers in the occupied cities. It was surreal. German soldiers watching them pass without raising their weapons. Dutch civilians lining the roads waving, crying, reaching out to touch the trucks as if they were holy relics. The convoy reached Rotterdam in the late afternoon. The city was a ghost of its former self. Buildings bombed out, streets empty. The few people visible were thin and pale and moved with the careful slowness of the malnourished. The trucks stopped at a central square. Within minutes, a crowd had gathered. Hundreds of people, then thousands, emerging from basements and apartments and hiding places drawn by the rumor that food had finally arrived. Tom climbed down from his truck and began handing out packages, one per family: flour, sugar, canned goods, things that had once been ordinary and now seemed like miracles. And then he saw her, Anna, standing at the edge of the crowd, thinner than she had been in December, her cheekbones sharper, her eyes more sunken, but still burning, still alive. She had survived the hunger winter. She had survived 6 months of 320 calories. She had survived crossing enemy lines a dozen times to bring intelligence to the Allies. She had survived. Tom pushed through the crowd. He reached her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say, nothing that words could capture. Then Anna smiled, that ghost of a smile that Tom had been dreaming about for months. "You came," she said. "I promised," he replied. And in the middle of a ruined city surrounded by starving people and the debris of war, Tom Sullivan wrapped his arms around Anna de Vries and held her as if he would never let go.